Hey, good morning, friends. Welcome back. This is the beginning of another week, and we are still in Nehemiah chapter 13. Coming to the close of this book, it's been what an amazing journey so far, and all the things that we've been able to learn. And if you were with us last week on Friday, we may have left you with some questions and wondering about, how the things that we discussed on Friday, how does that correlate with the rest of the narrative in Nehemiah? Well, actually, if those are questions that you've had, I'm glad that you have been thinking through those things, because actually in this morning's text, we're going to kind of do a flashback. We're going to try to fill in some of those gaps. Nehemiah is going to attempt to do that for us this morning as we look at these verses and verses 4 and following. I'll probably stop around verse 14. And I believe that's going to fill in some of the gaps for us in understanding the context of what's going on here in the chapter. See, the events of verses 4 through 14 are actually things that happened before verses 1 through 3. I know that might seem confusing at first, but I think it's all going to make sense in the end. What Nehemiah is essentially going to do, as I said before, he's going to give us a flashback, and he's going to help establish greater context and clarity to really what's a complex issue that's been going on in the nation of Israel in Jerusalem as they finish the wall, they've dedicated, they've restored temple worship, and so forth. And you would think that all the enemies were gone, right? We haven't heard about them for several chapters, yet one of those enemies is going to come back on the scene here this morning. Now, if you've already read through the passage, you know who I'm talking about. But if you haven't, we're going to pick up in verse 4, read through verse 14, and then we'll begin to unpack the passage together. So it says, "Now before this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time I asked leave of the king, and came to Jerusalem. And I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. I also found out that the portion of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, 'Why is the house of God forsaken?' And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses, and I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant Hanan the son of Zakur, son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service.'" So it's an interesting text here, isn't it? And as we look at verse 4 and 5, let me reread these texts for us if you haven't picked up on it already. "Now before this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who is related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests." So already it's like, wait, what? Verse 6 is telling us that Nehemiah has gone out of town. Okay? And as he is reporting back to Artaxerxes all that's happened in Jerusalem, which we'll cover here in just a few moments, we'll cover more of that. In his absence, verse 4, in his absence, he's appointed Eliashib the priest to be in charge while he is gone. Okay, that makes sense. But yet what we discover is Eliashib's dirty little secret that he is both related to Tobiah, remember, enemy from chapter 4, and he's now pandering to this man while Nehemiah is gone. Wow, right? Just when we thought we never hear from these guys again, here comes this surprise. We rewind back to Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 3. And where does Tobiah come from? He's an Ammonite. What did verse 3, 1 through 3 talk about on Friday? The Ammonites and the Moabites. Coincidence? I don't think so. What we just talked about on Friday is what providentially is being addressed upon Nehemiah's return, as he's now got to confront and deal with Eliashib, mentioned later in the text, or earlier in the text, I should say, and all these other leaders that are supposed to be kind of overseeing things while Nehemiah is gone. Now, here's the horrific aspect of these verses. Think about this. Eliashib is a priest. He is a man who is supposed to promote the worship of God alone. And yet, instead of doing his due diligence, in his position, he is placating to one of his relatives from Ammon. He sacrilegiously is allocating a chamber in the temple, where the tithes and offerings are to be gathered for the others that are involved in the temple worship. I mean, these tithes and offerings are supposed to be used to sustain these people. But now he clears it all out, gives Tobiah this chamber. He essentially desecrates something that is to be wholly reserved for the Lord, and allows it to be tainted by one of the confessional enemies of Israel. So this is a room or a place in the temple that's been given to an enemy. I mean, to us, we read this text and we're like, is he insane? This is completely ludicrous. Why would he do this? But apparently, Tobiah has enough influence and enough power that he's able to weasel his way in and get Eliashib to give him a place in the temple designated for him rather than the worship of God. And this goes back to our previous devotion. This is why we discussed on Friday why it was so necessary for this separation to occur, was it not? Because they didn't separate from these pagan idolaters. They become influenced, and then they become manipulated by them. And so rather than wholly committing themselves to God, they let an Ammonite come in and take up space in the temple. That's just how disconnected these people's hearts were from total abandon to the Lord. I mean, to us, it's mind-blowing. And so now Nehemiah is going to discover this when he returns home. But as he is penning this, no doubt post-event, he's going to explain for us how all this fell into place while he's traveling. That brings us to verse 6. While this was taking place, it says, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem, and I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. Now let me stop there for just a moment. So Nehemiah is doing what he's supposed to do. As the governor of Jerusalem and the one leading the project, he did so with Artaxerxes' blessing, right? It's natural that he would then return at some point and give a report. Whether this was the first time that he's returned or it's one of multiple trips. This is the one we have recorded here in chapter 13. That's what's important. He's giving a report. He's still under the king's rule and reign. And so Nehemiah does what he's supposed to do. He returns to Babylon. He spends some time there with the royal court. He updates Artaxerxes on everything that's happened. Now, whether this was weeks later, days later, or even months later, he asks the king, can I return back to Jerusalem? The king apparently grants that no problem. And so Nehemiah starts his journey back to Jerusalem. And what happens when he arrives is that Nehemiah expects, I would, as any leader should, with the best of hopes and intentions, that things are still going to be the way they were when they left, right? Except upon returning home, Nehemiah is going to discover that what's just mentioned in verse 1 through 5. Imagine Nehemiah's horror to discover upon returning back to his homeland that one of the sworn enemies of the people, one of the men that taunted him as he was leading the project to see the wall completed, one of the men who acted like he was going to be a part of this takeover, this conquest, wipe everybody out, one of the bullies on the block, has been granted permission by the priest that he left in charge to take up residence in the very temple they dedicated to God. Honestly, the first phrase in verse 8 is a complete understatement, is it not? We stopped in verse 7. Let me read verses 8 and 9. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. So I feel like that's a total understatement. If I were Nehemiah to come home and discover that this has happened, hopefully in a righteous way, I would be livid. Because this man's not mad for his own sake. He says, I was very angry, yes, but he's not mad because people didn't do what he told them to do, although I'm sure that's probably part of it. He's really mad that God has been maligned, and it's happened through this passive and possibly active permission of his own people. I kind of wish I would have been there when the rest of verse 8 played itself out. It says that he threw this stuff out. And I imagine the same scene where Christ is driving out the money changers out of the temple and overturning the tables as he is filled with anger at what they have turned the temple court into. Except in this case, Nehemiah is literally chucking furniture out the door or through the window, whatever the opening is. He is throwing these things out. The text tells us he literally takes Tobiah's furniture and throws it out of the chamber. And I wonder if Tobiah would have been there to see this happen. He's taken up residence there, right? Would he have watched his own eviction take place? Or if not, maybe he's back where he usually was and the word reaches him. I try to imagine the look on his face when he finds out he's literally been tossed out of the temple. See, Nehemiah is not going to take any time off to deal with these issues later. That's not how he is. He hears about this thing. It's absolutely wrong. And rather than say, well, I'll get to that tomorrow, he immediately, from what we see in the text, he immediately takes care of the situation. He throws out Tobiah's stuff, and then he calls for the chamber to be cleansed and reconsecrated for its original function. He brings it all back. He restores the chamber the way it's supposed to be. He is serious about doing things God's way and about not letting the people's enemies gain a foothold in their midst. And if it's not bad enough that an enemy has taken up residence in the temple, verse 10 tells us, I also found out that the portions of the Levites who had not been given to them, so the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. Essentially, what Nehemiah is telling us is that a further problem is being developed by Eliashib's deceit. Imagine you're one of the priests. Imagine you're one of the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and so forth. And you go to get your ration or your pay through these physical goods that are essentially being given to you so that you can eat, you can sustain yourself, you and your family, because you're working in the temple. You don't have the time to go tend to a field all the time like other people do. And then they find out that basically they've been fired because they're not getting paid. So what do? Well, in essence, they quit. They walk out. if they're not going to be able to get the things that they need, they're going to have to take care of themselves. They walk into the temple, and now this thug Ammonite is taking up residence in the temple chamber. So their response is they go home. They're going to fend for themselves. That's why we see in verse 10 it says, they had fled each to his field. And what other choice do they have? They've got to take care of themselves somehow. And if they're not getting the provisions they would normally get through working in the temple, they're going to have to go home and make a honest day's labor in their own fields. And so Nehemiah says in verse 11, so I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. So now what we're going to see is Nehemiah is going to confront these people who were left in charge, who failed to do their duty as leaders. And to give you a heads up, as we're closing out chapter 13 and the book of Nehemiah as a whole, this is the first of 3 separate times that we're going to see in chapter 13 Nehemiah have to confront a group of people. 3 times, including this one, we're going to see him say in the text, I confronted, and then fill in the blank, whether it's the officials, whether it's the nobles, whoever. This was a necessary thing, I want you to understand. These people did not need to be given a pass for failing to do their job. They needed to be called out. This confrontation needed to be handled in love, and it was necessary to help them understand that what they did was wrong. How could they have possibly thought this was a good idea to designate a room in the temple for some pagan idolater who in no doubt only looks out for himself, which is why he was there in the first place? You know, it reminds us, friends, we have a responsibility also to call out sin when we see it. Not because we're better than other people, but because we love other people. And we don't want to see them have to deal with suffering unnecessarily and effects of sin that could be avoided if they would just make better choices. We have a responsibility to call those things out. We have a responsibility to exhort others to do what is right, to bear with one another, to be long-suffering, to speak the truth in love, as Ephesians 4 tells us. Even when we know that those conversations aren't going to be as pleasant as we would like them to be. I love this quote from Jim Hamilton. It was in his commentary that I've been reading through as I've been studying through the book. I want to read it for us. This is what he says. If you see bad behavior in the lives of those with whom you are in covenant in your church, you should confront them. If you see ways that people are not living out and upholding the covenant that they signed, you should confront them. You don't have to do what Nehemiah does, but you can be a channel of God's love for his people. Be a conduit of God's kindness. Friends, we have that same responsibility. As Nehemiah is confronting these leaders and saying, this was not right. You must do better. We are called to do that with one another. Not because it makes us look better than the other person, but because it's a way of expressing love and grace in their lives. And that we would also want to receive that same kind of rebuke when necessary in our own lives. And so then we see the end of this portion of our text this morning, verses 12 through 14. Then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant Hanan the son of Zakur, son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. So now Nehemiah continues to rectify the situation. He regathers all the tithes and the offerings back into the storehouses, and then after doing so, he then appoints treasurers over these goods, and those people are named as we read in verse 13. But I want you to notice what he says. These men, as he points out, they were appointed to these positions because, as verse 13 says, they are considered reliable. They're considered reliable. They have a good reputation. And Nehemiah has no doubt that they will do, as the verse says, that they will distribute to their brothers as their job requires them to do. And so then he brings all of this to a close in this section with a prayer. He calls out on God in verse 14, and he asks the Lord to remember what he has done on behalf of God for his service and for the house of worship. You see, Nehemiah is seeking God's face again, as he so faithfully has done throughout this book. And to what end? We're not completely sure. But he is seeking out God's face, and he's asking God to remember that he did this. That he did this swiftly, that he did this thoroughly, and that he didn't do it at all for his own glory, but he did it for the glory of God alone. See, Nehemiah is determined to see God's name glorified in every situation. Even when he has to be the bad guy and right the ship, he doesn't want it to bring any attention to himself. He just simply wants to point people back to God. Get back to the worship of God. This is what's most important. And what a great thought for us to end on this morning. You know, this is a great evaluative way that we can gauge why we do what we do. Are we doing the things that we do because we want to draw attention to ourselves, to make others like us, or to want to be like us? Or rather, are we doing it solely because we sincerely want God's name to be glorified? We want him alone to be what is on display, because he alone deserves the glory, the worship, and the praise. You know, I hope for many of us the latter is in view. And if we sense, as we look at this passage and others in our private worship, that this is not our motivation, well, then let's take a hint from our devotion on Friday. Let's look at what the nation of Israel did at the beginning of chapter 13. As those verses show what they did in light of and after this confrontation that takes place in this morning's text. Let's take the hint from Israel that when we learn about something, as we put that mirror of Scripture before us, as I said before, we'll make those corrective measures quickly, so then that can be true of why we do what we do in our future endeavors. Thanks for joining me, friends, and we'll pick up more on the rest of chapter 13 next time.